Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, April 4th, 2022. I'm the chair for this evening, and I'd like to welcome my council colleagues and staff in the chambers and everybody watching the video or live this evening. I'd like to start off with a territorial acknowledgement and acknowledge that we are here in the traditional territories of the Wasanich people. And we have the agenda in front of us, Council. Are there any changes or additions to it? Seeing none, can I have approval of the agenda, please?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. We have public participation, and I don't believe anybody is registered. We have no one in chambers, so we will move on from that. Next, we have approval of the minutes of the regular committee of the whole meeting of March 22nd, 2022. There's a recommendation.
Move approval.
Second.
Second.
Any omissions or errors? Seeing none, all in favor? Motion carries. Thank you. And next we have staff reports. We have the tax distribution policy with a report from March 15th, 2022. That was delayed that evening, and we've put it on tonight's agenda, and we have a presentation by Mr. Andrew Hissick, Director of Corporate Services. Mr. Hissick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we are here today at Council's request to have another go at possibly changing our tax distribution policy. And because it's been quite a while since we looked at this, about 18 months now, I thought I'd take this opportunity to bring back all of the resources that we looked at last time and give you a thorough presentation, just so this can be the ultimate set of resources should anyone choose to look back and look at what we considered when we made these decisions. So most of what's covered in the report will also be covered in my presentation. I do have a number of background slides to get through, and if Council wants to ask questions at any point during the presentation, it's up to the chair to entertain, but I'm more than happy to do that if anything needs to be clarified. So tonight, the ultimate question we'll need to ask is why we're reviewing our policy, and then what we want to do with it, if anything. And to assist with that decision, I'm going to introduce a number of property taxation concepts, talk about what we look at from year to year in assessing our tax rates. That includes things like different property classes, the assessment process, taxes for other governments. Then we'll move on to what do we mean by tax multiples, do a bit of comparison with our neighbors, talk a bit about rate setting methods, and look at the impact of what's being recommended and what else might be considered. So starting off with a few general taxation concepts, we all know that all property owners within the town pay a share of operating the municipality based on the value of the property they own. And I like to think of it as a large strata corporation. Everyone who owns a piece of it pays into its operation on an annual basis. We have the annual property reassessments, which are a redistribution of the tax burden, if you will. So every year you pay a portion of the whole based on the value of your property, and the value of your property changes from year to year in relation to other property in the municipality. So properties worth more than they were the previous year will take on a larger proportion of the overall tax burden if they've increased by a greater percentage than other properties. And a very important concept is that municipal taxes make up only a part of the tax bill, roughly 50%, give or take 5 or 10%. And municipal tax rates that we set also impact the regional district and the library taxes which we collect on the tax bill. More on that later. So I think it's also well known that non-residential properties pay taxes at a higher rate than residential. And by non-residential, I mean commercial, light industrial, recreational. And that's a province-wide norm. It's pretty much expected that non-residential will pay at a higher rate. And higher rates paid by non-residential classes might be viewed as a subsidy to the residential tax base. So it allows municipalities to provide a higher level of service to residents than the residents would otherwise be willing to pay for. However, it should be noted that residents pay their taxes in after-tax dollars, whereas non-residential taxpayers pay in pre-tax dollars. So for example, $1,000 in taxes for a business is equivalent to $700 if they're paying a 30% income tax rate. The property assessment process, the annual property valuation is performed by an independent Crown corporation called BC Assessment, and it's an arm's length valuation that eliminates any possibility or conflict in us doing our own assessments. And having one provincial body do it across the entire province creates efficiencies and provides a level of consistency. As mentioned, the annual valuation is a redistribution of the tax burden. So even if there's no tax increase in any given year, some properties will pay more and some will pay less than they did in the previous year because of that change in valuation. And this whole system, it supports the concept of a tax based on the value of the property you own. And that's different from income taxes or consumption taxes. So all properties are grouped into 9 established property classes, the most common being Class 1, residential, and Class 6, business and other. And there are different tax rates set for each one of those classes. So BC Assessment sets the values, and the town sets the tax rates for our own purposes as well as a couple of other jurisdictions. So both the municipalities and BC Assessment have been reinforcing for a number of years that an increase in assessed value does not mean an increase in taxes. Taxes are based entirely on the town's revenue needs. If we don't need any more revenue, then we don't have to do anything with our tax rates other than offset what happened on the assessment side. This is a snapshot of how things stack up across the different classes of property. So residential makes up roughly 88.5% of the town's assessment base, with commercial, business, other making up 9.4%. So between these two classes, you've got virtually the entire assessment base. Meanwhile, in terms of taxes collected, residential only represents 74% of our total, whereas business makes up over 21%. So the two charts illustrate the difference. The one on the left is percentage of assessment, so it shows that that purple slice is business. They make up 9.4% of the total assessment base, yet they contribute nearly 22% of the taxes. And that's part of why we're here today. Do we want to bridge that gap to some degree? So as mentioned, we collect taxes for a number of jurisdictions on the annual tax notice. Chief among them is the province of BC for school taxes. And that's not dependent on use of the school tax system. It's a society-wide benefit. Whether you have children in school right now or not, you're paying for education. And school taxes are largely offset by the homeowner grant for residential properties. So if you own one residential property in town, chances are a big proportion of your school taxes will be offset by the homeowner grant. Another levy we collect is the BC Assessment Levy, which simply pays for the annual valuations. There is a line item for Victoria Regional Transit, which pays for a share of our regional transit system. The MFA, Municipal Finance Authority, levies a nominal amount, roughly 10 cents for the average taxpayer. There's also a line for the Regional Hospital Levy that pays roughly 30 to 40% of the capital cost for all hospitals within our region. Also on the tax notice is the Capital Regional District Levy, which is our share of regional and sub-regional programs, and some of those programs are optional while others everyone pays for. Most of the town CRD levy is for panorama recreation, roughly 53% of it, with another 19% for regional parks. So between the two of them, that's about 3/4 of the overall CRD levy. There's another line item for the library levy, which is for Vancouver Island Regional Library. And it's our share of the system-wide cost based on our population and assessment as a percentage of the whole system, which is largely outside the capital region. Most local governments within the capital region are part of a different system, but Sydney, North Saanich, and Souk remain with VIRL. So those two levies, CRD and library, plus the municipal levy, make up what I like to call local service taxes. Those are the three that roughly equate to the same basket of goods across the entire region, and more on that later. So out of all those levies on the tax notice, there are many different rates and multiples used, and only one of them is the town entirely responsible for. So the municipal tax levy, which is about half the bill for residential, the town develops the budget, we set the tax rate, and we control the multiple. So that being the difference between residential versus non-residential rates. For regional library and regional district, we also set the rate and control the multiple, because the multiple is the same as it is for municipal. For regional hospital, we set the rate only based on multiples given to us by the province. For 4 of the other taxes on the bill, we have no control over those whatsoever. So we're told what rate to charge, how much to collect, and we have limited input on the budget for those entities. For some, we do have representation on regional boards like transit, but we don't have nearly the control we would for the municipal budget, for instance. So a graphical representation of where the tax dollars go. For the average residential property, roughly 64% go to local services, that being municipal, regional, and library. And 27% goes to school taxes, but for those properties that qualify for the homeowner grant, which is the majority of them, that is reduced to a much smaller amount. On the business side, we control less of the overall tax levy, at roughly 57% for local services. So 43% of the tax bill for the average business we have no control over whatsoever. So regardless of what policy decision we might make tonight, roughly half of the tax bill will remain untouched for non-residential properties. And I should add to that that business does not benefit from the homeowner grant, so they don't get that reduction on the school side. A very quick and basic look at how taxes are calculated. We take the BC assessment valuation for the year. We subtract from it what we call non-market assessment, which is growth in the tax base, to come up with a net. To that, we do a calculation to see what base rate we would need to collect the same amount of taxes as last year, and that's our starting rate. And to that, we apply the general budget increase, which was 3.76%, and come up with a new base rate. A couple of minor adjustments to that, and we have our final rate. And this is under our normal rate setting process. If we choose to do something different, it'll get a little more complicated. So following this process, we set our new rates for the year. The 3.76% increase is applied evenly across the board, and it creates a new set of tax multiples based on all the inputs that came before. And as mentioned, we also then set the rate for the regional district and the library. So going way back at Town of Sydney tax policies through past research, the province used to set tax ratios, the multiples, for local governments as late as 1984, at which time they stopped doing it. It's likely a combination of wanting to give local governments more autonomy and also realizing that one size does not fit all. Nevertheless, the town continued to use the provincial class multiples for another 6 years until 1990. Since 1991, we've applied the tax increase equally to all classes, subject to minor adjustments from time to time. From 2006 through 8, there was a policy decision made to slightly bridge the gap between residential and business taxes. So we brought residential taxes closer to 70% of the tax burden. That had the impact of reducing non-residential, and it reduced the multiples as a result. But, you know, that was a long time ago, and without policy intervention, it does tend to creep backwards. There was also a time where classes 5 and 6, being light industrial and commercial, they went out of sync for a few years, but now they've been equalized again, and we have a policy to keep the rates for those two classes equal. So, according to our long-standing practice and policy, it tends to smooth out the impact of market growth in the tax base. So the only thing that changes the amount coming from each class essentially is the non-market change. So the growth in the tax base, if it's greater in one class of property than another, that will very slowly increase the amount of overall taxes coming from that class of property. Unfortunately, BC Assessment isn't always consistent in what they consider market versus non-market change in our tax base. So we're paying a lot more attention to that when the valuations come out each year to try and get a better handle on it. Since 2009, the community charter has required that the town articulate its tax policy as part of its financial plan bylaw. It's a weird place to put it, but so be it. That's where we have to do it. It's a way to make municipalities more accountable and encourage us to consider our policies from time to time. This is a new slide that I've thrown in there since I distributed copies, but it's nothing you haven't seen before. Just to finish up on that point, here's what is included currently in our financial plan bylaw with respect to our tax policy. Council will strive to set tax rates and ratios to maintain stability between property classes, factoring in non-market growth. It sounds okay, but what does it really mean? If you're not a practitioner and not doing it year to year, I don't think anyone could really figure out what our policy direction is from that. The second one is a little more straightforward, that the multiple for classes 5 and 6 not exceed 3.0. Easy enough. We've been below that for quite a while. But if we hadn't had our reduction in 2020 due to COVID, we would have been getting dangerously close to that 3.0 multiple again. We haven't been there for over 20 years. The third point is that the multiple and tax rate for classes 5 and 6 should remain identical. That's important to keep in there. Otherwise, we'll get out of sync again. And the fourth one, which was recently added, is that the distribution of taxes across the various property classes be reviewed in the current term of council. So, well done, we're reviewing it. So, if a decision is made based on this review, this is where it'll be articulated. And this is a way to make sure that the next person looking at this has some idea of what council's direction is with respect to tax policy. Moving on to tax multiples, a little bit more detail about what those are. So as mentioned, the different classes pay taxes at different rates. So the ratio between another class and residential is the tax multiple. For example, if the tax rate for class 6 is 5.599 and the rate for class 1 is 2.217, and these are our 21 rates, 5.59 over 2.21 equates to a multiple of 2.525. So that means businesses pay taxes at a rate 2.525 times the residential rate. What that leads to for a property assessed at $800,000 is, if it's residential, it pays $1,774 in municipal taxes, while that same $800,000 property, if it were a business, would pay closer to $4,500. So again, residential is also eligible for the homeowner grant, but non-residential pays in pre-tax dollars. Those are always mitigating factors. So it's nice that we know what multiples are. I think we all intuitively know what tax rates are, but I think it's important that neither multiples nor rates are considered in isolation. They're just numbers. It's part of an overall equation. So rates are adjusted annually to reflect changes in assessment. And if assessments for different classes change at different rates, that impacts the multiple, even if there's no change in taxes paid. And that would not be in any shift in the town policy. It's just the way our rate setting works. And that has to be factored into any future policy change. So just to illustrate what I mean, a simple but effective table. So if we start in year 1, in this case 2018, we have a property assessed at $500,000. If it's a class 1 residential property, apply a tax rate of 2.0, results in $1,000 of taxes. That property, $500,000 property, if it were business, let's say our rate is 4.0, that results in $2,000 in taxes instead of $1,000 for residential. And the difference in rates, 4 over 2, results in a multiple of 2.0. So now we move on to year 2, 1 year later. The average residential property increased in value by 10%. So we're not going to increase our budget at all. We have a stable budget. We don't need any more revenue. What we're going to do is reduce our tax rate for class 1 from 2 to 1.8182. And based on the higher assessed value, that again produces $1,000 in municipal taxes for the average household. Now, moving on to year 2 for a business property, the average business only increased by 5% instead of 10%. So that assessment only went up to $525. So once again, we're not trying to raise more revenue. So we simply reduce our tax rate for class 6 and apply that to the new average assessment, once again, you get the same $2,000 in taxes that the average business paid the year before. But you'll notice in the last column, the multiple has now gone up. So the average household is paying the same as in the previous year. The average business is paying the same as it did the year before, but the multiple is now different. And that's nothing to do with town policy, or it didn't produce any increase in overall taxation. It's just a factor of the rate setting. Moving on to year 3, the average residential property increased quite a lot, by 30%, to a new total of $715,000. Because of that large increase, we still don't have an overall revenue need. We haven't increased our overall budget, so we're still looking to collect the same $1,000 from that residential property. So we dramatically reduce our tax rate to 1.3986, and once again, we're collecting that same $1,000 from the average household as we did 2 years prior and the year before. Moving on to Class 6 business. Again, it's the same 5% increase as the previous year. And again, there's a slight reduction in the tax rate. And once again, we produce the same $2,000 as we did the 2 previous years. But then going on to the multiple in the last column, once again, it's taken a big jump. So what used to be 2 in 2018 is now closer to 2.6 in 2020. But we're still collecting the same amount of taxes from the average business as we did in the previous 2 years. I don't think I need to follow through with year 4. I think it's pretty clear by now. And that's why looking at multiples or rates in isolation, neither of them makes sense. It's all part of the overall equation, and it's all part of the overall context. So for these entities that look for us to set a target multiple of 2.0, it really doesn't make sense to me, and it never has. And down below that table, just a quick look at the actual changes for the town over the last 6 years. So you can tell that in most years, residential increased at a much higher rate than business. 2020 was one change from that pattern, where the average residential property actually went down in value, which is unusual for recent trends. Whereas business went up by a fairly significant percentage. In 2021, the average business went down in value. For the current year, the rate of change residential to business is close to 3 to 1, so you're going to see a larger reduction in the tax rate for residential as you will for Class 6, which once again, based on our example, will mean a higher multiple.
A question from committee member Mayor McNeil-Smith.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to Mr. Hissick on this previous slide that you had up. Thank you. And I apologize if you've answered this question directly, but in looking under the Class 1 side of the chart and going to the year 2019, we understand that the tax rate is reduced because you're continuing to collect $1,000. What's the policy that what is the policy that specifies that you will continue to collect $1,000 under taxes that triggers that tax rate because of the assessment value?
Well, this is very much a simplification. You have to leave a few of the variables constant, and in this case, it's the taxes we need. So, in this example, there is no general tax increase across the 4 years, because I don't want to complicate the example by adding in that, that needless extra layer. So this is strictly an an example of what happens before any general tax increase is applied. So it's step one in that methodology that I showed you a few slides back, where we take the new assessed value, look at the same revenue as last year, and come up with a new base rate. So if there is no general increase to that base rate, then the base rate remains what it is. So in this case,
The base rate of 1,000.
Mm-hmm. If there were a 3.76% increase for budgetary reasons, then that would be applied to that new base rate. And it would still remain lower than the previous year's rate, but
But that 3 point, whatever the increase was, would
Yep.
apply to both,
Yep.
both classes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
so just to really, I don't want to belabor this, but just to drive home the point of what looking at multiples and the difference in changes between different classes would look like over a longer time frame. So I've taken our 4-year example and given you a couple of 10-year examples. So in the top table, the residential assessment goes up by 10% a year, whereas the business assessment goes up by 5% every year. So you see over 9 years of change, the multiple goes up from 2 to over 3, with absolutely no change in the taxes paid by the average business. So just to illustrate how looking at the multiple alone can really put things out of alignment, where the average business continues to pay the exact same from year to year. And the table on the bottom half is the same idea, but just a larger gap between the average residential increase and the average business increase. So it shows the multiple getting even more out of whack over 9 years, from 2 to 3.6, even
So
though.
if I may, Mr. Hisek,
Sure.
to focus on the multiples is less of an issue because the multiples are a moving target.
Mhm.
It's, we're dealing with the value of a piece of property and the taxes we require to manage the town. And probably the bigger focus is what share of the taxes each of the different classes pays, rather than focusing on the multiples. Would that be correct?
That is correct. I mean, and admittedly, this is a simplification. It's never quite this smooth, but if you focus on the percentage of taxes, it will somewhat mirror the change in multiple over the long term. And that as we move further along here and start talking about the percentage of taxes to percentage of assessment ratio, if residential continues to grow at a much higher rate over time, eventually it will bring the tax rates down for commercial, simply because we have a policy to do so. So according to this example here, there's really no intervention, and we're assuming that
We've just lost our image.
Both screens are flickering.
I wonder if that's the wind?
More likely a cable connection, because it's inside the room.
sorry, my mouse is coming apart here. All right. Right. So, not again.
This screen, it just went to.
This one?
They're both flickering now.
For people watching the video, we're having some technical issues that are affecting the monitors in the council chamber, and you may not be seeing any change on your video at home, but bear with us.
Thank you, Councillor Wainwright. This is where we have a musical interlude, perhaps. So we're still working on it, folks.
Andrew, we're good enough with this, because there's no audience.
All right.
I was gonna say, if we mess around, we might lose this one.
All right. I'll
Can everybody on
Ignore
council
that
see
one.
the screen all right?
Do you mind if I turn it off?
No, that's fine.
Did I
We've
answer?
lost it again. Oh, there we go.
So did I address that question clearly
Yes,
enough?
thank you very much,
Okay.
you did.
So,
Oh, sorry, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What I'm trying to figure out or understand better, so the tax rate that you're talking about, we're talking about the mill rate? Or
same thing.
the same thing, okay.
I like to call it tax, but anyway. Mill
Okay.
rate was going out of fashion for a while, but it's coming back now, so.
Oh, okay. So, I understand how the general mill rate gets calculated.
Mhm.
What I'm less sure of is how you determine the tax rate for the different categories. Once you've got that general mill rate, or do you calculate a mill rate separate for each class based on their percentage of the assessed values?
Let me go back a few slides
Okay.
here. So basically, our policy is to apply the general increase equally across the board. So it's just a matter of doing the math, coming up with a new base rate, applying the general increase across the board, and that creates a rate for each class. So
Okay,
in the absence of any policy intervention, that's how we've done it for a long time.
okay. So back in 2007 or 8, the council of the day was happy with sort of the distribution of the different classes in terms of the percentage. And so that was the baseline at that time. And then, so since then, we just look at whatever the increase is, and then you apply that increase to each class based on the amount that is already part of the baseline for that category.
That's right. Essentially, it's been the same since we started setting our own rates. The only differences were those 3 years, 2006 through 8, when council made a conscious policy decision to bridge the gap a little bit. But it was,
Okay,
I stress, a little bit.
okay. And then, so whatever that increase just gets added to those base rates for each class, and then that's the starting point for the next year?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, I think I've got that, thank you.
Okay, moving on. So, there are 6 different multiples used on the tax bill. So the one we control, town, CRD, and library. Then there's the regional district. Those multiples are set by the province. There's the school tax multiple, which again, provincially set. Transit multiple again. So there's really only 2 different rates there. BC assessment is and MFA are all provincially set. So the town has control over one of the 6, and that's roughly half to 2/3 of the tax of the overall tax bill. And the 2 points to note in that table is that the town multiples for classes 5 and 6 are lower than those set by the other jurisdictions. So while we can make a policy decision to bring it much lower, it's still going to remain fairly high for purposes of non-residential school taxes, transit, and so on. That table shows last year's multiples in case anyone's wondering. A quick look back over the last 15 years for where the multiples have gone. So this is, the gray line is business, the orange one is light industry. So it shows that between 2009 and 2015, the 2 were out of alignment, and then we brought them back in line. And since we've brought them back into alignment, they've been at the same rate and will continue to be according to our policy. So same information, but looking at a slightly longer time frame. So going back to only 2007, we were just under a multiple of 3.0 back then. And this year we'll be roughly at 2.74. If you take a longer look back, just going back to the year 2000, we were actually we were using a much lower multiple back then, and it gradually crept up to over 3 in 2006, and then it's been fluctuating quite a bit since then. This chart shows the business tax rates in blue versus the multiple in orange. It's kind of interesting, doesn't really say much. It just shows that the multiples are more stable than the rates are. So this illustrates the municipal versus the provincial school tax multiples for classes 5 and 6. So the gray line at the top is the provincial multiple that we have no control over, and the lower orange and blue multiple line is what we do control. So other than the one-time COVID reduction by the province in 2020, the provincial multiple for business has been considerably higher than the municipal multiple. And
Mr. Histic, if I may, Councillor Garnett has a question.
sure.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Histic. Just out of curiosity, is there a rationale that you're aware of that why the province charges business, commercial business higher percentage on their tax bill for school taxes than residential?
I don't have a definitive answer on that one. It's just, it's always been that way. There might have been a valid policy reason at some point, but I've never heard it articulated. I mean, there's various ways you can speculate about why that is, but I can't give you a definitive answer. It could be the pre-tax versus after-tax component, or it could be just provincial policy to subsidize the residential class. I mean, there are many resource communities where it makes sense for non-residential to provide a large subsidy for purposes of attracting workforce, that kind of idea.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
So that 2020 nosedive in the provincial multiple, that was a large one-time reduction in the school taxes due to COVID. What the town did was a 10% reduction, which really made a dent in the gap between residential and business. But without intervention, that gap will be closed over time. We can't possibly undertake a review without some comparison with other municipalities. And what I'm going to focus on is our regional neighbors. Now, there are a lot of challenges in comparing our taxes to those of others. Chief among that being is not everyone provides the same services, and even if they do, might not be at the same level or quality. Furthermore, not everyone includes all the services in the municipal rate. For example, a lot of jurisdictions, especially the larger ones, will have their own recreation functions. The City of Victoria, Saanich, for example. So their recreation is covered under the municipal tax rate, whereas for us, recreation is a sub-regional function through Panorama Rec, and we collect that on the regional district levy. Same with library. Many roll that into the general rate. We do not. And the primary goal of tax policy is to address our own needs, but we can't help but compare to others. And if we are going to compare, I want to do the best job I can in narrowing the difference in that basket of goods. And that's where this local service tax idea comes in, where I include municipal, regional, and library, combine all that. And I call that local service taxes because across the board, everyone in the region has those services. They might not be at the same level, but we can't eliminate that difference. All we can do is try and make it as comparable as possible. But ultimately, the primary goal of tax policy is to address our own needs. You know, making comparisons easy with other jurisdictions is a very low priority for me, and I think it should be for all of us. We have to look at our own needs only, and if they compare favorably with others, great. If they don't, well, we might have different needs. And certainly in doing this comparison, by no means do I imply I'm criticizing those that might have a higher rate or higher multiples than we do, because we don't have the full information about what they're trying to do, what policies they're trying to enact, what revenue or service needs they're trying to fulfill. With that disclaimer in place, here's a quick look at where we stood last year in terms of tax rates. So in terms of residential rates, the town was third from the bottom. We had the third lowest rate within the region at 2.86 per thousand in assessment, and that is below the average within the region of 3.15. And of course, it's just a simple average, not weighted by size of municipality, but we compare favorably. On the business side, we're even better. We were second lowest within the region for business rate, and once again, quite a bit below the average. For those that prefer a chart to a table, same thing here. Residentially, we are third lowest within the region in terms of a tax rate for residents, below the average. And for business, second lowest to our neighbors, Central Saanich. So shifting to the multiple, which again is the ratio of the business tax rate to the residential tax rate, which last year was 2.52. We had the second lowest commercial tax multiple in the region, well below the average. So one of our neighbors, Central Saanich, was below us. The other one, North Saanich, was top of that table. But they do have a policy direction to gradually bring that down. Same thing in a chart format where near the bottom. So we've looked at where we stand, but that doesn't have to be the end of the discussion. Are we satisfied with where we stand regionally in terms of commercial taxation? If we are, then consider policy wording to keep us there. If we're not satisfied that that's low enough, or that the gap between commercial and residential should be further reduced, how much lower do we want to go? And if we do wish to reduce the gap between business and residential, not just how low, but how quickly do we want to get there? So within the staff report, there's a suggested phase-in period of 5 years, but that's just a suggestion. And also there's a starting point of 2023, not the current year. Once again, it's just a starting point for deliberations. But once we do have a policy direction, it'll be important to articulate that in our bylaws so that we remain on track. In terms of tax rate setting methods, the report mentions 2 commonly used methods. One is to, this one being the most common, is to set and maintain a stable percentage of taxes from each class of property. So at some point, Council of the Day decided that the percentage of taxes from residential and commercial was roughly appropriate. And since that time, it's changed very, very slightly, largely through growth in the tax base. Now, the other common rate setting method used, and it's much less common, is to set and maintain a constant tax multiple. So for instance, if we were to look at a multiple of 2 for business, just keep that stable from year to year regardless of what happens with assessments. So the town uses a variation of number 1, and we apply the tax increase equally to all classes of property. And non-market change is the only thing that shifts percentages from year to year, although because residential is such a large proportion of our overall tax base, it's a very gradual shift. So shortly after the last time we considered tax policy, I was beginning to lean towards a third methodology, which I'm calling a hybrid method for now. If it gains any traction, I'll come up with a better name. It's really around a percentage of taxes collected versus percentage of the assessment base. For example, if we want to collect twice the percentage of taxes from the business class as the business class makes up of the assessment base, that would be a ratio of 2.1. So if business assessments make up 10% of the tax base, we collect 20% of taxes from business. That's a 2-to-1 ratio. And that is the policy that is recommended in the staff report to be phased in over a number of years. I believe it's less arbitrary to tie in the percent collected to the percentage of the assessment rather than what I think is a more random 2.0 multiple. The one side effect of this is that the annual tax increase would no longer be applied equally. So as we look to move towards and then remain at a certain policy ratio, there would be a slight adjustment each year to the tax increase that's approved through the budget process. So for instance, for this year, that 3.76 could turn into closer to 5.0 if we choose to make a shift as early as this year in our rate setting policy. So despite what we know intuitively about residential assessments having risen higher than commercial over the past 25 years, the overall growth over that period has not been that great, only 2.25% from 1997 through now. So in 1997, residential made up 86.2% of the tax base, and this year it's 88.5%, so roughly 2.25% shift. Whereas over that same time frame, Class 6 decreased from 13.38 to 10.7. And as a percentage of tax revenues paid, Class 1 went from just under 71% back in 97 to just under 74 in 2022. Whereas for business, it decreased by 4% over that same time frame. So this is a chart of percentage of assessments over percentage of taxes collected from classes 5 and 6 combined over 25 years. And this is a chart of the ratio of taxes collected versus assessment base. So that 2.0 that we supposedly want to get to, without intervention, it would sit at 2.3 in 2022. It's been, if you look back at the early years, so the in this chart, 2000 through 2002, that ratio was under 2, and again it dipped under between 2013 and 2016, but in 2017 it took a jump up again. Over that 25-year time span, the average ratio is 2.1. So if we were to move to a goal of 2.0, it would not be that different. It would just be a smoothing out of that 25-year trend. So this colorful but confusing chart is a comparison of the tax multiple to the tax ratio that we're talking about. So in all cases across that 25-year time span, the multiple has consistently exceeded the ratio of tax to assessment. That's why I think going to a multiple of 2.0, while I consider it wrong for many other reasons, I just think it's too radical a shift and it would have too big an impact. So that's why I'm recommending this tax to assessment ratio. Oh, just to finish off, a ratio of 2.0 in 2022 would produce a multiple of 2.2975. So the impact of lowering the Class 6 multiple to 2 times the residential would be a tax equivalent of just under $700,000, which equates to a tax increase of 7.6% for the average resident. This is over and above the 3.76. So to me, it's a non-starter to go to a 2.0 multiple in 1 year. The tax impact would be about $155 additional dollars a year, including regional and library. So clearly, that's too big an impact to implement all at once. It could be phased in, but I'm not recommending using the multiple at all. So the same illustration for that ratio of 2.1 instead of the multiple of 2.1. So lowering the Class 6 ratio to 2.0 would have an impact of about $400,000 on the taxes, which is an equivalent tax increase of about 4.4% for residential property, which is about $89 more per year. These numbers differ slightly from the copy of the presentation you have because we just got the final assessment figures on Friday, and I've updated to reflect those. So if we were to take that impact and spread it over 5 years, we're looking at an additional 1.87% tax increase in 2022. So that 3.76 would go to 5.22. So some people often wonder why there's just the same tax rate for large businesses versus small ones. So the large businesses like the multinationals, the banks, grocery stores, and so on, have the same rate as a small mom and pop operation on a one-off, locally owned retail operation on Beacon. Well, that's provincial legislation that requires that they all fit into the same property class. We are completely powerless to change that, and we're stuck with that system. Now, the other side of that equation is if we reduce the Class 6 rate, it might not be passed on to local consumers anyway. So if there's national or regional policy pricing in place, for instance, let's say Sobeys or Thrifties, they have national pricing. If we lower our taxes here, there's absolutely no reason to think that groceries will be cheaper for local residents because they'll be applying the same rate at least throughout the region. So our residents would pay more taxes without getting the benefit. But, that might not be the benefit we should be looking at. The benefit might be a healthier local business community. So I provided a table in the report illustrating what the impacts would be for a 2.0 multiple as well as a 2.0 ratio. That was supplemented in the first version of the presentation with a 5-year phase-in scenario, and I further added another year to that just for discussion purposes. If council were to raise a 10-year phase-in instead of 5, that's what year 1 would look like for 2022. So again, a 2.0 multiple has a much bigger impact than a 2.0 ratio, so I'm not recommending it. So year 1 of a 5-year phase-in for a 2.0 ratio would be a 5.7% tax increase as opposed to 3.76, whereas for the average business it would be a 4.3% decrease. Taking the illustration a bit further, across those scenarios, this shows what taxes were for the average business over the last 3 years and what they would be. So in 2019, the average business paid $58.09 in municipal taxes. With the 10% reduction in 2020 that council put in place due to COVID, it went down by $600 or so. Last year it went up only by the general tax increase. I don't even remember what that was, 2.7 I believe. And this year at 3.76%, it would go up to $54.34, which is still roughly $400 less than pre-COVID. So the impact of that one-time 10% decrease is still being seen by the average business. And on the right in the yellow bars, you're seeing the various scenarios. The first one being if we were to move to a 2.0 ratio in one fell swoop in 2022, the average business would see a reduction of about $700 over the base scenario. If we went to a 2.0 multiple, it would be a $1,200 reduction. The second to last yellow bar, that would be a 5-year phase-in at the 2.0 ratio. It would go down by over $300. And with a a 10-year phase-in, it would go down by about $250.
Mr. Hissick, I believe we have a question from Councillor Cornett.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Mr. Hissick. Yeah, is it possible to go back to the slide before, just because the 10-year one was new and I was trying to get the numbers?
Sure.
Thank you.
So if it was a 10-year phase-in beginning this year, it would be roughly $30 more for the average residential property over the base case. So instead of an increase of $66 over last year, it would be an increase of $97 for the average residence, so under 100, roughly $8 a month.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
That largely concludes my presentation. If there's any aspects of the report that you'd like me to clarify or anything within the presentation, I'd be pleased to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Hissick. Council, questions? Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. What I'm thinking about is that based on historical information, whatever magic you were working in the last 20 years seems to have served us fairly well in terms of when we look at where our rates are compared to other jurisdictions. There doesn't have seemed to been, it seems that we've been sticking fairly close to, well, we have been below that 3.0 mark, aside from, with the benefit of that 10% tax reduction. So it seems to me that it's been working pretty good, whatever it is that we're doing there. And so I wonder, I understand the multiple thing doesn't make sense, the percentage thing on its own doesn't make sense. And so I'm wondering why you think what is that about the hybrid method that you think might be better than what we're currently doing?
Well, essentially the question sometimes comes up is, why do businesses pay property taxes at a higher rate than residential properties? And I can't come up with a really good answer. So intuitively, I think maybe that difference should be reduced to some degree. And what is the appropriate degree? Recognizing that businesses pay in pre-tax dollars, so there's always a rationale for some difference, but should it be as big as it is? Maybe our difference isn't as big as others, but if the average business owner came to me, or the owner of the average business, I should say, came to me and asks why we charge a higher rate, I don't have a really good answer. So to me, intuitively, we should look to reduce. So the question is, if so, by what method, when do we start, and by how much? But really, it's council's decision. If you're happy with where we stand regionally and we don't think we need to go any lower, fair enough.
Right, okay. Yeah, I have some comments as to that question, but I'll save that for discussion. But the other thing I'm wondering, are you aware of other jurisdictions that use this hybrid method, and any feedback, or have you heard anything in your circle of tax people and finance people as to whether that's been used before, with any level of, and any comment on how it's worked?
Well, while my research has not been exhaustive, nobody in this region uses this method. Generally, it's the same one we use, where roughly they keep it status quo with, from time to time, applying some policy adjustment to bring them more into alignment, like North Saanich is doing now, trying to bridge that gap a little bit. So no, I'm not aware of anyone using this particular method, but not to say no one is. It's just,
Okay.
there isn't definitive research out there. You look at past studies, the city of Vancouver did a major one, spent a lot of money on consultants to do it. Victoria tried something about 10 years ago. I don't think they got very far. So there's not a lot of examples to use. It's just my professional judgment, and this is, I think, the best I could recommend.
Okay, and just one
Yes, go
One
ahead.
more, okay. Historically, so years ago, the Council of the Day, I think, what was that, in 2007, 8, they decided an adjustment was warranted, and they shifted more of the burden to the residential class, which seems to have worked out okay. And what I'm wondering is, so we've done this 10% tax reduction for business for 2 years in a row. And, residential class hasn't had to absorb that because we had the COVID relief funds, but that's gonna come to an end. So I have some concerns about how we would end up absorbing that. And I guess I'm wondering, does it make sense to, if we think that there needs to be some sort of better alignment or adjustment, would it be to, have we done it already in terms of, just like the council back in 2007, 8 did an adjustment, that we have sort of made an adjustment to that baseline that's been used for 20 years by reducing the, by 10% for the business class?
Sorry. Well, I think we've clearly made a big dent in it. If it wasn't for that, we'd be a lot further away from what could be our goal. So the 10% reduction went a long way, but it's up to council to decide if that was enough. You're right, it will have an impact on residential. There's no way around it. I think I point out there's only 2 ways to accomplish this. One is pass it on to residential, which is by far our largest contributor to the assessment base, or reduce spending, and that's really difficult to do without impacting services. So maybe one longer term benefit of this is if we do, like I mentioned earlier that the higher rates paid by non-residential are a bit of a subsidy to the residential class and allow us to provide a higher level of service than we would otherwise. So if we bridge that gap, I think there will ultimately be more pressure to control spending. I mean, it's not an unlimited, there's only so far we can take it. I mean, looking at the phase-in, no one wants to pay more taxes, but they're very, very modest shifts to the residential class. If we're talking $30 a year, that's, I hate to say it, but that's nothing. It's $2.50 a month to make a difference for the business class. So, but in the long term, it does, because we're already so low on the regional front, like if this caught traction and others started to follow, I think there are other governments that would see fairly large shifts to residential, and that could force a bit of a look at spending and not just raising the taxes, and maybe that's not a bad thing.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Chair. So I wanted to, the one thing I really wanted to pick up on was the comment my colleague made that we seem to have been doing a pretty good job over the last 20 years at that, things look reasonable. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but it's the only reason that things look good is that council has intervened several times over that period. And in fact, we even have a policy that if the multiple ever hits 3, council has to intervene to do something. So it's, it has been an ad hoc, we're doing okay, because council from time to time has had to step in and do something. And we have not provided direction that keeps things on a level footing. In fact, what we heard Mr. Hissick say is that lacking some kind of policy, we can expect things are going to drift, and it'll be an unpredictable drift. But eventually, probably expecting that multiple to go up again. So I think that we should really be looking at trying to adopt some policy. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but if we can adopt some policy that we could live with for maybe 10, 20 years that makes things better. If, this is something totally new. You haven't got a robust look around. Other people have got a perfect solution. I've got quite a bit of faith in staff coming up with creative ideas, but I don't expect it to be perfect first time. But let's come up with something that we can try, and a future council in 5, maybe 10 years can look at it and tweak it if appropriate. And actually, I think our staff, if they get 3 to 5 years of experience with some new method, they'll probably suggest adjustments if they think there are some needed. So I'm really quite open to going in this kind of direction. One of the other things I'd comment on,
Okay, I'm just going to, just for a minute here.
Sure.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Hissick? Because if we don't have any further direct questions for Mr. Hissick, then we're going to be going into general discussion. So is that where we're heading now? Okay. All right, thank you.
okay, one of the things that we've talked about as having to get factored in is this non-market growth. So it's not changes of assessment, but basically new construction. That's actually a bit of a simplification right there, because we tear down a bunch of single-family residential and we build something new which may have commercial in it. So we actually switched some of our residential assessment to commercial, and we don't keep track of that. We just assume everything is new built and that we don't subtract anything from the previous. I like this assessment hybrid because it's actually basing off the total assessment, and new construction gets rolled up into that, and demolitions get rolled up into that as well. So it's something that sounds like it has the flexibility to adjust to that kind of change in our assessment base. And we can in a particular year have a ton of construction go on in our commercial industrial area, and what's going to happen then is that the total assessment of commercial will grow quite a bit. If our policy has to, we can't really simply look at it and go, commercial is always paid 20% of our total tax base. We're going to continue to have it pay 20%, even though we've had this huge amount of new construction. Your policy's just got to think about things like that. Mr. Hissick's proposal actually has all those elements. So I'm certainly open to exploring it.
Thank you. Mr. Hissick, yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Councillor Wainwright put into mind something I meant to cover earlier. Is, as I mentioned early in the presentation, the annual assessment process is a redistribution of the tax burden. So within one class, if residence in one area is worth more in the second year than it is in a different neighborhood, that higher valued residents will take on a bigger proportion of the tax burden. And that's an important component of, why do we bother doing evaluations every year if we're not going to let it play out? So our tax rate setting methodology right now tends to smooth out those shifts from one class to another. And that's why using this 2.0 ratio, it recognizes that the business class will be a certain percentage of our assessment base every year, and the amount of taxes it pays should be based on that percentage. So if it goes down over time, the taxes paid as a percentage of the overall should also go down accordingly. And that's why this ratio is important. So this method would essentially remove that artificial negation of the year-to-year shift in taxes, if you know what I mean. So whereas valuation is meant to redistribute, our policy kind of moved that backwards.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hissick. Councillor Keefe.
Thank you. A question through you, Chair, through Mr. Hissick. Can you explain for me again? You mentioned with the hybrid method that the downside is that the annual increase would not be applied evenly. So I'm trying to understand a little bit more how that would work.
All right, so I showed you earlier I apologize if the numbers here are hard to see, but I showed you earlier how we calculate our tax rate. So we come up with a new base, and then we apply that equally, and there's no further adjustments other than, a bit of rounding here and there. Now, if by applying it equally, you are not making any real progress towards reaching a target ratio. So if you want to reach that target, you have to manipulate the business tax rate downwards. And in doing so, that loss of revenue has to be picked up by another property class in this case. The only one that's left that really matters, which is residential. So because you're bridging the gap, you're reducing the amount collected from business, which means the amount collected from residential has to increase. Therefore, the tax rate increases and the percentage is no longer equally applied. Makes sense?
I'll have to let it sit with me for a bit.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Rentoul.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Hissick, for the presentation. I'm not inclined to look to see a change in what we're doing currently, and I do feel like we have policy, and that's what we're doing. We're reviewing the policy, and the policy indicated, as Mr. Hissick pointed out, an opportunity during your term of council to review that policy once during your term. This is the second time we've done it this term. Sharing Councillor Keefe's observation that would appear we've done quite well. I'm very pleased to see your assessment of where we are in the region with regards to comparing both residential and business tax rates. So it feels like using this as a catalyst to shift tax burden towards residents at this time probably isn't appropriate, and with the information before me, I think I'd rather see us, see future council do as we've done, and that's review it during their term of council and make the decision either to make an adjustment or to look at the modeling, as has been outlined this evening. So I'll leave my comments there, Chair.
Thank you very much. Mayor McNeil-Smith?
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the discussion. I would like to put a motion on the floor and then speak to it, that the difference in tax rates between the residential and business property classes be made gradually over 10 years using the hybrid rate setting method as presented, and that the reduction begin in 2023.
Second.
Discussion?
So if I might, Chair, thank you. Several points to make. One is appreciating that we're that our policy is to review tax rate policy during a term, and we're doing that with regards to us having already considered it in this term, and we did postpone it when we last considered it, is we were considering it during the pandemic. And we had made a decision in 2020 to reduce the business tax rate by 10%, which was a significant tax policy change within the term. We didn't do it as a long-standing measure to adjust in the longer term the tax rates between the classes, but more as a measure to assist along with the other many government programs to provide some assistance to the business community. And we know that, and so we did only make that adjustment in 1 year. It's had a benefit of carrying over for a number of years, but as Mr. Hissek pointed out, that will gradually ease off, and we will be back in a situation where we can see the fluctuations. And the graph has been the graphs that have been presented over 20 years or so have been relatively smooth. I mean, but there have been changes. And as previous colleagues have commented, that council did have to intervene, or chose to intervene to adjust a tax policy because the shift was becoming too great. And I feel that that this hybrid model as presented to us will reduce that fluctuation over time. Again, as colleagues has commented, it may not be perfect to begin with, but it will, I foresee it in the 5, 10, 15-year period, smoothing it out such that we don't have to invoke what is in our current policy, that if it does reach 3%, we have to immediately address it, or address it in that tax year. So isn't to say that we won't have to review, and I would look that council would continue to review tax rate policy during a term, have a presentation in terms of what the trends are and what the changes are, and that it may need some adjustment. But I think this policy would serve us well in a longer term of as I say, 5, 10, 15 years. The reason I'm a little, and I take note of Councillor O'Toole's comment with regards to leaving it to the next council for consideration, because the next council under our policy would review tax rate policy. There's been a lot of work go into this. We've had detailed presentations, and again this evening. And I think we have the information before us to make a good reasoned decision. We're in essence making that decision for future councils, but we're making a long-term policy change. And one option is given that this would not take effect to 2023, is we could pass no motion this evening and just receive this report, and then the next council would likely receive pretty much this, I would anticipate pretty much this same presentation at around tax time. It would be a new council, not knowing how many new members there would be on council, but it would be a new council, and I think given with the considerations that we've given in the presentation that's made, that it would be appropriate for us. I did in between receiving this on a previous agenda, which we forwarded to this agenda, ask staff about what the impact might be for a longer period, and we saw the or the additional information of 10 years, and I would appreciating what that difference might be in the first year using a 5-year scenario. I think that we're in a relatively good position. This will be smoothed out over time, and I think a 10-year period is just a little softer in smoothing that out over a period of time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Would the seconder like to make a comment?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hissick, for your presentation and for the work put into this. I agree with many of the comments that Mayor McNeil-Smith made as well. Appreciating that we do have good standing regionally speaking in terms of our numbers. That's not necessarily my primary focus. Primary focus is basically on looking at how we can help benefit our local businesses, large and small. And in one of your slides you mentioned there's not really a benefit to the residents per se, it's more to the businesses, but if you allow this to stay on a nice stable flow over time, and you allow them to have some kind of a bit of a break over time, it does benefit our community, because it increases the likelihood of secondary and tertiary jobs being created in the community, which is also a benefit for a lot of kids growing up in terms of grocery stores and things like that, and just providing an overall better economic environment for Sydney going forward. So I'm actually was gonna ask the question before you brought forward the 10 years. So thank you for that. I think it's a sensible solution. I think it, as Councillor Wainwright pointed out, there's another benefit that I didn't even think of that he's brought forward about the commercial space that gets developed in residential buildings, and having to be able to capture that. And I think overall, I think this will be a good benefit for our community. And I like what I've heard so far, but I'm wanting to hear more from the rest of my members of the committee if they have anything more to say. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor O'Keefe.
Thank you. I'm not in favor of the motion. I don't think this is the right time to be doing this. So for a number of reasons. So I'll get first to the point that we discussed about fairness. So, why should businesses pay more? It's a commonly accepted thing across the province and across the country. And it makes sense for some of the reasons Mr. Hissick claimed in terms of the deducting property tax for income tax purposes. But it also makes sense for other reasons as well. So if you think about the average family in Sydney, I think our households are 3 or less now. So how the average household benefits. So there's 3 people living in a residential property paying taxes, and so those 3 people go out and use the roads and our parks and everything else. A business in the town would probably have thousands of people that visit in a year. So they're benefiting from the town's infrastructure, our sidewalks, our roads, our traffic lights, all those things, in order for people in the town and around the region to come to their business. They also benefit because from the other things we do, our investments in arts and culture, the investments that we've done on the waterway, the waterfront, putting in washrooms, so it attracts more people to the community as well, and so that's a benefit for the business community as well. Other things that I'm taking into account with this is, in terms of, as I said before, it seems that we've done a fairly good job in terms of the tax rates that we've set for the business community over the last 20 years. And I've been on, so going on 4 years on council, and that 4 years I've been the representative to the Chamber of Commerce for that whole period, and also to the SBIA for 2 years. In all this time, I haven't heard anything lobby from the Chamber of Commerce or other business organizations saying that, gosh, Sydney, you've got to do something about your taxes. Your tax rate is way out of whack. You're losing business because of it. You're unable to attract business. Like, that's not happening. And in fact, when you look at how we've done over the last couple years in terms of attracting business, we've done really well. So during COVID, which was a terrible time for business, we didn't lose a whole lot of businesses. In fact, we attracted dozens and dozens of new businesses. Staff gave us some statistics, I think, for the first or second year of the pandemic. And I think at that time, so far, there had been an additional 65 new businesses that had set up in Sydney. You know, often when I did a bit of research, as I do with these things, because I don't know a lot about tax policy, but one of the main reasons that municipalities often look at adjusting their tax rate is because of the impact it has on the business community and to attract new business. But in our case, it doesn't seem that is a factor. As I say, we're not hearing from the business community that this is a concern for them. You know, we've had Amazon set up within our municipality. They're pretty shrewd business people. And I would have thought that if they thought that our tax rate was out of line, that they might have looked somewhere else. Now, granted, you know, they wanted access to the airport and the ferry and our location, but there were other areas that they could have considered. So I guess in terms of fairness, I've covered that. In terms of the impact on the business community, I'm not hearing from them that this is a factor, so I don't feel inclined to move on that. And then I balance that out with how it will impact our residential taxpayers. And so the thing that comes to my mind and to all of our minds is affordable housing is probably the most important thing in our community right now. And we hear that from our business community as well, is that we have to make it more affordable for younger people, for a workforce to live here. And so what I worry about is by giving a benefit to the business community, which I'm not getting the sense that they really, really need at this point, we're putting that extra burden on residential taxpayers. And a higher tax bill, say perhaps for a young family that wants to set up in Sydney. So that's a concern with me. Just a couple other things. In regards to if we hadn't already provided the 10% tax break, I might feel a little bit differently. But what I'm concerned about is delivering a triple whammy to our residential taxpayers. And what I mean from that is, so first of all, as you've seen from the statistics, is that residential assessments have increased significantly more than the business class has. I think it's like triple the amount. And so residential taxpayers, because of that, will automatically assume more of the tax burden overall. So that's strike number one for them. Strike number two is the 10% tax deduction that we made already to benefit the business class. And once our COVID funds run out, residential taxpayers are going to have to absorb that as well. So I'm thinking of those two things, and then I'm thinking about potentially another hybrid method or a different method of calculating tax, and that again is sort of the triple whammies, so to speak. I don't think it's a waste of time to go through this process. I recognize that staff have put a lot of time in it, we have, but I think it's a good thing to do, to have this discussion. And I'm still happy to be doing what we've been doing, at least for a couple years. I'd like to see us get through figuring out how we're going to deal with that 10% tax reduction, first of all. And once I can see that we can deal with that, maybe in a year or two, I would be more open to considering something else. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wainwright.
Thank you, Chair. So this tax policy stuff is complicated, and I'm just going to repeat one of the key messages that Mr. Hissick said, and that was assessments going up doesn't mean that your taxes go up. So there is no triple whammy because the residential assessments have gone up a lot. Because our tax setting policy actually, if we don't do something about it, looks at the total amount of money we need to collect from the residential and distributes it over that assessment. So if our budget does not go up, even though if we don't need more money, if we don't have to raise more taxes than last year, your assessment could go up 200% and you won't be paying more taxes because we don't need to collect more taxes. So we're going to collect the same amount as we did last year, even if your assessment went up 10,000 times or dropped by 500%. You know, so that's a really key message. Anyway, so I've been on council a fairly long time, and I have heard the business community repeatedly lobby for tax breaks. They haven't been doing it in recent years, but you know, gee, we just cut the commercial rate by 10%, and that seems like it's likely to have prevented the business community from doing that kind of lobbying over the last couple of years. But I will say, and I know others that have been in the business community a long time, I know that the business community has been lobbying for lower taxes in the past. They just haven't been for the last couple of years. The other thing that I think Mr. Hissick indicated was that we're seeing a trend of residential assessments going up more than commercial, which basically means that if we don't have any policy to try to keep things in check, we are going to hit that 3 times multiplier in a few years, because that's just the trend of residential assessments going up more than commercial. Anyway, I do think that the motion makes sense. I don't think it's going to be perfect, but I don't think it's going to be badly out of whack within 5 years. And I think that staff will be able to review it, and the council of the day will be able to tweak the policy, or if it's really bad, they can roll back to what they used to do. But I do think this, it's well-intentioned, it seems reasonable, and we have had to act in the past. So this looks like the potential for providing staff some reasonable direction and not relying on the council of the day to step in and do something radical like a 10% drop. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'll turn to first-time speaker, Councillor Duncan.
Thank you. I'm in support of this motion. I would have been in support of it if it was over 5 years as well. The amount that we're looking at changing the actual tax burden on residents is so small. I'm not concerned about it. $30 is not the difference in affordability. The difference in affordability is hundreds of thousands of dollars in the valuation of property taxes, or of properties, due to global property interinvestment bubbles caused by massive amounts of people parking money in real estate as a financial investment. It's neither here nor there. It is not something residents look at, really, is the $30 difference. Perhaps investors will care very much about small amounts of differences, but people actually living in the houses will not. And certainly I've heard from the business community that they wanted us to review this policy. They may not have done it during our term, but they certainly did it when we were door knocking, and I certainly heard from them when I was running that this was specifically an election item that they wanted me to commit to doing in order to to vote for me. And Mr. Hissick alluded to it when he said that there were groups that had wanted us to look specifically at the multiple. It was an organized group of business owners that asked for that, some of them in writing. I know that they have to council, so it would be incorrect to say that this is not something that the business community has wanted. It may vary depending on which segments of the business community, but overall it is something that we have heard, so I'm in support of this motion.
Thank you, Councillor Duncan. Councillor O'Keefe, you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, no, just a point of clarification that in regards to the assessments, I get the point that just because an assessment rises doesn't mean your taxes rise necessarily. The point I was making is that it makes a difference when the rise between the classes is significantly different, and so that's what we're seeing. So that because the increase in assessments, according to BC Assessment Board, the market value change for residential, I think, was 24% in the last year. In the business class, it was 7%. So it's 3 times. So if all things were equal, if the rates, if the assessments, the classes were rising sort of equally within their class, then it wouldn't make such a difference. But because the assessed rates for residential are significantly going higher at a faster pace than business, then that's where it makes a difference. So just want to clarify that.
Thank you. I'll take a moment now and add my comments to this. I looked at this and I too have paid attention to requests from the business community and not hearing it, whether they haven't been speaking up in the last little while because they've had the 10% reduction during COVID and that met their needs or some of their needs, and so therefore they weren't asking or whatever. I don't know, but I also look at this and I think adding on to the residential homeowner by increasing their taxes, regardless that it's $30, because everybody breaks things down into the small compartment and say, all right, this is going to only cost you X dollars. And then comes the next one and say, well, we're only going to be raising our prices by X dollars. It's when you put all of those pots of X dollars together where the problem comes in. And as we've heard from members of council and certainly Mr. Hissick in the report, is our standing within the region is actually very good, and I don't see that there is a problem. And as it is the policy to review our tax disbursement policy, distribution policy during each term, I'm quite comfortable in saying we've reviewed it, we've done the work, and we will carry on the way we are. And the next council will take a look at and say, if the time is right now to change how we're using the tax base between the residential and the commercial, then so be it. But I'm comfortable with leaving things the way they are right now. Thank you. And Councillor Garnett, you wish to
Thank you,
speak.
Chair. Just sort of to speak to not hearing feedback from the Chamber and the SBIA. I know one particular business specifically who is in the SBIA and has had no communication with the SBIA either way, their way or backwards. So, and they are in favor of this, something like this. So I'm not specifically sure whether or not getting that specific feedback from those organizations represents all business opinions on the matter. So I'm comfortable with that aspect of it. I do understand what Councillor Fowlett's saying in terms of it's one extra cost where inflationary costs are really high right now, and it's just one extra cost on top and top and top, especially for people who are on a fixed pension or have limited resources and trying to pay it. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that, as Councillor Wainwright pointed out, this is, having to come back again. Like if another COVID happens, we don't have to investigate a 10% reduction. We have something in place that allows for something moving forward that gives us a lot, or the council of the day, more leeway in terms of having to come up with some kind of emergency decision to help or break down numbers to that 3 that everybody talks to. So I like the fact that this is, it seems really level-headed to me in terms of the approach, and that it'll the fluctuation aspect and not having that be a problem, or as much of a problem, if this works out. And to me it likely will, but as Councilor Wainwright said again, staff's going to be reviewing this constantly. It's not they're going to sit there and go, oh, we'll just put it in place and we'll never look at it again until it's a problem. So I have full confidence that if something should arise, we'll hear about it. But I think it's the way to go forward. I think it will really benefit our business community. And as Councillor Duncan said, it was a commonly heard theme. And I think just because you're not hearing it now through those organizations or specifically doesn't mean it's not still there. It's not gone away. So I will be supporting the motion. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments from council? Mayor McNeil Smith, if you'll just read out your motion one more time.
Actually, I would defer to the,
Thank you.
just if it's how it's recorded.
So the motion is that the difference in tax rates between the residential and business property classes be made gradually over 10 years using the hybrid rate setting method, and that the reduction begin in 2023.
Thank you very much. If there's no further question, then or comments from council, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? 3 opposed. Councillor Rintoul, Councillor O'Keefe, and Councillor Fallon. Thank you. And thank you very much, Mr. Hissick, for tonight's presentation. And thank you, Council, for the discussion on the tax policy. We have our recommendation to go forward to council meeting. And so we have one item left on the agenda, and that is adjournment.
Move adjournment.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor? We are adjourned. Thank you very much.